Hey, happy Tuesday, everyone. And thank you for joining us for our latest sponsored webinar from Riskonnect, building a comprehensive testing program for true resilience. Our presenter today is Jamie Goodloe, MBCP, a lead business continuity consultant in business continuity and resilience division of Riskonnect. She's worked in the business continuity field for over 15 years at companies such as Capital One, USAA, and OnSolve. Goodloe has consulted with organizations of varying size and complexity, hailing from different industries across the world, to support the implementation and improvement of business continuity programs, technical disaster recovery programs, and executive level crisis response programs. So right before we get started, I want to tell everybody there will be a little bit of room for questions at the end. And if we don't get to yours, they will be sent along and be answered via email at a later date. With that, Jamie, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you to everybody else who is attending today. I'm really excited to talk about comprehensive testing today. This is a topic that has been near and dear to my heart for a number of years. And frankly, I've been interested in presenting this for a number of years and just haven't had a chance to sit down and pull it all together until today. So I hope that you find everything that I want to talk about today interesting and useful for your program. I do want to highlight that it is really, really hard to talk about building a comprehensive end-to-end testing program in a 50-minute window. So I've done my best in today's presentation to, at a high level, articulate how I think you can do this successfully. There is certainly a lot more content that I will not be able to get to in a lot of great depth today. And so I would like to say at the end, I will put my contact information up on a slide. And for any of you guys who know me personally, you probably know how passionate I am about business continuity. I love to talk about this stuff. So please reach out if this is something you're interested in implementing and you'd like to talk through any additional specifics. But today, we're going to focus on some learning objectives and some of the topics I'd like to cover. So I want to talk about how you can design and implement a holistic testing program that spans the entirety of your organization. It's a big ask, but it's something that I think that is very, very important. And I'd like to talk about some ways in which I think that you can do that. Throughout the presentation, we'll be talking really about how important it is to identify and define the key roles that are necessary to support your testing program, making sure that you have the right structure and detail around those so that you're getting the right deliverables and the right types of work out of the supporting roles that you're going to need to have available for you to make this program effective. Actually, throughout this presentation, you'll probably hear me reference quite frequently how siloed we tend to be in our programs and how important it is to break down those silos. I say on the slide, right, it's important to break it down between IT and the business, but really it's any group. It could be cyber, facilities, your executives, making sure like you understand that your testing program should be comprehensive and holistic and not siloed in the way that some of our organizations are. The hot topic here that I think everybody's probably really interested in talking in more depth about is how you can accomplish end-to-end testing in a hybrid environment. I think all of us nowadays are in some level of a hybrid environment, whether it be geographic and global distribution of employees. You might have complicated application deployment patterns, multiple data centers, internally hosted, externally hosted, just all of the parts and pieces sort of playing together. Pretty much everybody is in some level of a hybrid environment. And so how do you make a testing program that accomplishes this end-to-end testing that I know a lot of us are being asked for when you're in an environment like that? And then additionally, I really want to spend some time talking about the importance of translating your typical testing results that we're all probably used to generating, turning those into resilience posture metrics, because that is more critical and a more valuable way to be able to articulate the success of your program and the strategies and the plans and the BIAs that we all have in place. So this is all kind of going to flow a bit across all of these different objectives. And I hope that you find this to be very helpful in ways that you can implement some of this in your program going forward. Now, I always like to start my presentations by focusing on a standard. So whether you're a financial institution, healthcare, whatever type of industry you are in, hopefully you are aligning your program to some sort of a standard. You've got some sort of a guiding light, whether it's ISO, FFIEC, whether it's just best practices or whatever it may be. I would challenge you before you go through this work to build your program out to look at your standards to make sure that what you're engineering meets the needs of whatever standard it is that you're adhering to. Since ISO applies broadly, I wanted to use that for today's discussion. So for those of you guys who are familiar, actually for those of you guys who are not even, there is a standard. It's International Organization of Standards. ISO is what that stands for. 22301 is the Business Continuity Management System. What I'm about to flash up on screen is an excerpt from that standard that outlines what your testing and exercise program should do to satisfy these requirements. So I want to put those up on screen and talk through that a bit first before we even get into building this program so that we know whatever we're building is going to be in alignment with the standards. So we're not going to read this all verbatim, but I want to highlight the first sentence in the testing section really articulates that you need to be in your testing program validating over time the effectiveness of business continuity strategies and solutions. And I would argue that's really the key takeaway, though there's some additional components that we will talk through here. They give a little bit more flavor, not a lot of specificity, but a few sort of attributes that you'll want to make sure that you bake into your program as well. But really, truly, I want to focus on the fact that they are really just making sure that you can validate that your strategies and solutions you've put in place are actually effective. So here's sort of the attributes that ISO defines as critical for your testing program. At a high level, it's making sure that it's in alignment with your objectives. You've got clearly defined goals. You're practicing that muscle memory and getting people skilled so that they're ready to respond to these types of events in real life. And yet again, you see bullet D here says, taken together over time, validate the business continuity strategies and solutions. So I think it's important it's called out twice. I think that really hits home and essentially articulates the big thing that they're really trying to hit here. Now, in addition, they also call out, right, you need to produce an exercise report. You need to promote continual improvement. Matter of fact, they even call that out twice. So equally as important, but not the topic of today's discussion. So holistically, guys, there's a lot of stuff on this slide here. There's a lot of specific words that we haven't read, word for word. But really what I want you to get out of this in looking at this is that any standard out there is essentially wanting to know, are your strategies valid? You've written BIAs, you've written plans, you've said you're going to do these things, but do they work? Are they going to sustain your business, right? Those are the things that they're going to want to know. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I want to leave this up on the screen for reference here because I'd like to highlight that nowhere in this standard or even in FFIEC or any other standards that I've ever seen specific to business continuity, nowhere in them does it say your business continuity program should test this. Your disaster recovery program should test this. Your cyber program should test that. So my question to you is, why do we build our testing programs separate? I understand that's how we have to organize our groups, from a leadership perspective. But at the end of the day, the so what of that requirement is that you're proving that your company is resilient. So I would recommend that you build your testing program, not under BC, not under DR, that you build a comprehensive testing program that spans the entirety of the enterprise, because really, you're not going to be able to get out of an audit finding or a regulatory finding by saying, oh, that's DR's responsibility. They don't care whose responsibility it is. It's your company as a whole, and you need to be able to articulate your resilience posture holistically. So we'll continue to talk in the remainder of this presentation about the value of a program, but I really just wanted to highlight this definitely should be done at a higher level than we're typically used to operating, just because of the way that we kind of have to organize our teams based on the different types of work that we do. Okay. So let's talk about how you can design and implement a holistic testing program. Now, before I dig into this any further, I do want to highlight, you're going to hear me throughout the presentation referring to testing and exercising. I know there are a lot of conversations in the industry about the difference between those words, and in some cases, some companies might define them differently. For purposes of today's conversation, I'm using these words interchangeably. There's probably a whole conversation or a whole other presentation that we could do that can kind of parse out how we can define those. But for today's purposes, let's keep it simple and just assume that they're interchangeable. Okay, so let's talk about how you build a holistic program. First, storytelling. This is my sort of key, most important fact out of this entire presentation that I want to make sure that you really, really understand. It's very important for us as business continuity professionals to be able to articulate our resilience posture. As we mentioned, right, looking back at that ISO standard, it doesn't actually give us a whole lot of specifics of you need to test once a year, 10 applications, and they must all meet RTO. And if they fail, you must retest within 90 days. I didn't see that anywhere. What I did see is them wanting to understand, are your strategies and solutions valid? And so really they want to know, are you resilient and how do you know? So how do you know? And my answer to that is you have to be able to tell your story, right? We are now all in an environment where we have some level of, I don't know if hybridity is a word, but we have a hybrid deployment, whether it's people, technology, suppliers. 20, 30 years ago, we might have had some small companies where your data center, your people are all in the same place and you don't rely on suppliers. And so once a year, you can do that DR exercise where everybody, fails over your infrastructure. You move all your employees to another location. You do one big test and you're good for the year. But now we've got, global, regional, geographically dispersed deployments of people. We've got multiple data centers, companies own multiple data centers. You're using a lot of SaaS applications. Sometimes internal and external applications talk to each other and require each other. So there's really not a way for many companies that I've seen, actually any company I've seen recently, to be able to do one big bang test and say that you're good to go. Really, you need to be doing those sort of singular tests, figuring out how to then glue it together and then tell the story. The narrative is very important. Okay, so let's start by focusing in on some steps that you can take to build out your program to get to the point where you have this story to tell. Step one, I would say, define your holistic testing program scope. Now that sounds really simple to do, but I'm going to tell you first, you're probably going to have to change the way that you think about scoping. A lot of the times now when I work with companies, the companies are telling us, hey, I scope a DR test by saying everything with the disaster recovery strategy must test. Okay, yeah, that's probably one thing that you should test. However, I would challenge you to say that a holistic testing scope is not reflective of capabilities. It's reflective of your needs. So at this point in the game where you're defining your scope, it does not matter if something has DR or can be tested. That's another step in the process. Our scope are the things that we care about, right? And how do we know what we care about? Well, we do BIAs, and your BIAs are going in and they're saying, here's the applications I use, here's the suppliers I depend on, and all of those details. And so I would challenge you to think about your scope from a program perspective, really, really focused on your needs. Okay. Now I've got some caveats here. I've indicated that your testing scope should be BIA dependencies. And then I say mostly. There are some other test types that we will articulate and focus on in today's discussion. So those will come next. And I will also say that you don't necessarily have to say all BIAs are in scope. But I do say that once you determine which BIAs are in scope for your program, all of the dependencies within those BIAs should be scoped for your testing program. Okay. So some companies I've seen, you might decide to only apply your testing program to your critical processes. That's great. You might say, we're going to test every application in a critical process. You might do an iterative approach where you're going to test all the applications in a critical process this year. And, 2 years from now, you're going to do the less critical. That's perfectly fine. But the point is, anything within the BIAs that you scope should be considered for scope for your program. And we will have a conversation down the road as to whether or not they can test. Okay. So spend a little bit of time on that. I do, as I have these conversations, I know this is a little bit of a challenging concept for folks to really absorb, especially as you work through some of the nuance, but I would challenge you to start your thinking from that perspective, because your auditors and regulators are going to be looking from that perspective as well. Okay. So then what's the next step after you define your scope? Well, of course, it's to have a panic attack, because I just told you all of your dependencies in a BIA should be considered for scope, and that's probably a really big list. But actually, you really shouldn't have a panic attack, and I'll tell you why. First and foremost, I know you as an individual or your team, even if you have a team of 20, there is absolutely no way that BC professionals can test every single component that a company relies on. It's just not possible. Even if you have a team of 20, you've got other jobs to do, and it's just too much. So I would challenge you to say that your job is, in fact, though, to define a program to ensure that the things that you scope do get tested, and then to tell the story when all is said and done, right? It's a matter of saying, this is what we're going to do as an organization, getting the results, and then telling the story after the fact. I think that is absolutely part of a business continuity person's role, and also will help you even from a risk perspective as well, because you're going to get a very unique lens into a lot of different things by doing this. So after you've, worked through the initial panic and you've started to realize and understand, right, that we are going to change a little bit of the roles and responsibilities as to who all is involved and who all is supporting these types of tests, now we need to spend some time actually getting in and building your test program. I'm going to highlight a handful of high-level components that I think that need to be developed for your testing program, and then we'll go into more detail on each in future slides. So the very first thing that I think you need to consider putting out is a testing standard. That's the thou shalt documents. Now, this can be built in alignment to other standards like ISO, like FFIEC, and that's what I've done in the past. I've gone through those standards and found the you musts and you shoulds, right? It's very clear when you go through those documents, you can pull out the things that you're going to be asked to deliver upon. So I would recommend that you take those and translate those into standards for yourself. It does take a bit of logic, right? Because they're not always super, super clear and concise, intentionally so. But building out that standard of what it is that we need to test and what needs to be tested on an annual basis is very key. Next, you need to clearly define the roles and responsibilities. If I say that X needs to be tested on an annual basis, who am I measuring that against? If that X does not get tested, who is out of compliance? And that's a very important thing to define in your process and your program to make sure that you have in place, because clearly you'll have some misses, right? You're probably going to have some conversations with business executives. So really understanding those roles and responsibilities are going to be key. I'll get into more detail on another slide that goes into a few more specifics on that. Additionally, you're going to want to make sure that you have the ability to standardize and capture exercise results so that as they're occurring, you can consolidate them together so that you have a comprehensive list of all of the exercises that are completed, so that you can present that information back to the business owners. Okay, so if I go out and do 10 application tests and 20 supplier tests and test the facilities in 20 different ways, I bring those results back. I go pull BIA data and say, this process depends on these 3 things. Let's pull those results forward and give those to the business so that they see how the exercises, conducted and went throughout the year. And to be honest with you guys, I've seen a lot of companies get this far, right? You've got the standards, you're gonna define what needs to be tested, you're going to standardize results, you're going to know to consolidate those results, and that's great. But a lot of companies do not take this extra step of facilitating the business impact analysis of the results. And that is huge. This goes into your storytelling, right? If you've produced me 100 different test results that tell me RTOs were met, that does not tell me if that meets the needs of your business. It does not tell me, can you continue your processes? It doesn't tell me where some of the pain points may be. And so it's really important that you take those exercise results and put them back in front of the business so that they can perform an impact assessment and say, my processes would have been effective, or my processes wouldn't have been able to be performed. And we'll get a little bit more into those specifics as well. And then once you gather those results, then you're ready to produce your final exercise report, which is essentially a resiliency report of saying, we've done a lot of tests. Here's how we know our company is or isn't resilient, or, here's some of the things that we did confirm. And, here's some action items that we have that we've identified that we're going to go and move forward so that next year we have better results. But it's all in that narrative. And you cannot get that narrative unless you're doing those business impact analysis of the results. So the next slide, I really want to talk through, these are some example testing program requirements. And I apologize, I know this slide is busy. I really intended it more to be a tool sort of behind the scenes, but I do want to talk through some specifics here just to give you an idea. There are 3 types of tests that I have articulated here that need to be in your program. We've hit a little bit on sort of the top 2. But we'll go in a bit more depth, and then we'll talk about sort of the larger scale exercises that probably a lot of us are more familiar with conducting on an annual basis. So starting from the top down, I've essentially said, right, one test type would be resource specific, where you're testing the strategies associated with the resources, right? So you'll want to define a testing scope of, any application in a critical BIA must test annually. Any application in a non-critical BIA must test every other year. You might even go further and say, hey, we know that the business doesn't necessarily know all the back-end applications. And so we're going to add an additional, scoping statement in there that any application that's not in a BIA, but that's deemed critical also must test, right? So these are just kind of 3 high-level examples. You might want to get a little bit more detailed or specific, but it essentially articulates the business has said these are the things that we need. Therefore, we are going to test those critical things on a periodic basis in alignment with, those timeframes. You do the same thing for suppliers, right? You might put a requirement out there that if it's in a critical BIA, the supplier must exercise on an annual basis. Now, this may vary depending on supplier, whether they're able to, allow you to participate in exercises versus they do an exercise on their own and provide you results. That conversation is down the road as to how or what it looks like when they do test. For this perspective, you are really just defining what we care about and what should test. And then the next step would be that we can go backwards and figure out if they can test and what do we do if they can't and what do we do to kind of solve for some of those nuances. So some samples that you may use in a facility, similar, right? I would tie it back to your BIAs. Any facilities in a critical BIA must you must test the generators and the elevators and the, security equipment on a periodic basis, right? You may determine what that looks like depending on your footprint, depending on whether you lease or own. There's a lot of variables that can be factored in. But that's what I mean by resource specific. You're testing the specific resources and their alternate strategies. But there's a thing that's missing if we only focus on the resources. Within business continuity plans, we ask our teams to say, tell me all of your applications, tell me all of your suppliers, but also tell me what you do if they're not available. Those are also strategies. So I would also recommend that you consider putting testing requirements on individual plans that either they need to test one strategy annually, or maybe they need to test one of each strategy on an annual basis. But that is periodically and over time testing the validity of your strategies and solutions. Okay, so that's the second type of test. And then the third type of exercise would be your large scale or scenario specific. And a lot of these are ones that we are probably already facilitating. These are probably the ones that gave us the panic attack to think that we had to do more of those, right? This may be your large scale data center failovers. It may be your notification exercises. It might be your cyber or crisis management team tabletops. These types of exercises still need to make their way into your scope because you're testing executive response, the general and overall, recoverability and responsiveness for your organization holistically. So all 3 of these test types need to occur in order to be able to really truly articulate your resilience posture as a company as a whole. So make sure that all of these 3 are accounted for in that standard that you're documenting to ensure that these do occur. Okay, so as I'm sure you can imagine, because we're making scope so broad to say that it's anything that we care about, it's logical to understand that there's probably going to be a lot of things that need to be de-scoped. I argue with the wording de-scoped. simply because of what it can apply. And that's probably a nuance for another webinar. But basically, right, you know, if you're scoping everything, there's going to be some standard things that just aren't going to be able to test when it comes time to execute. And so spend some time on the front end of developing your program to think about what some of these reasons might be. And so I've got a couple examples here just to kind of make the case, but this is going to be highly variable depending on the company. So a good one that I'm sure everybody has kind of thought about, because we said everything was in scope. Well, what if there's an application that's in a BIA that doesn't actually have disaster recovery? How do I test that? Well, you can't if it doesn't have disaster recovery. But I would recommend that you do one of two things. You either consider having a scope category of in scope, no DR, or what you could potentially do is have a program scope and an exercise scope, right? Where you remove it from scope. Like if you're doing a data center exercise and it can't test, it might get removed from the exercise scope. But from a program test scope, I think I would still recommend leaving that as in scope, but no DR, so that you can essentially articulate it was assessed and evaluated because it was identified as a need. Another example, and this comes up quite frequently, and I'm sure you guys, any of you guys have done this over time, have probably kind of giggling a bit, but whenever, particularly with an application, you say that it might be in scope to be tested, there's the possibility you're probably going to get informed that some of your applications will be sunsetted at some point. And so you might have a plan and a strategy to respond to that. I personally have run into that many times over the years. And initially, when I first started doing this, I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. If they're, not going to be here in 3 months, we might as well not test them. Now, the kicker there is that in those cases, multiple times those applications have appeared on my scope the following year. And so I learned my lesson. So that's a side note, but I would basically challenge you guys to think about, right, what is and isn't okay. What type of a process would you follow if somebody said this is going to be decommissioned? And typically I would put parameters in there to say, okay, we maybe don't have to scope that, but because it comes with some risk of, maybe you might have project slippage and this might come up again next year, maybe we're going to require some level of approval from a VP, from an IT VP and a business VP, whatever the case may be. But try to think through these scenarios that are kind of come up, and so that you have standard reasons for deviations from scope. It's going to make your life a lot easier when you move into the actual execution itself. And then I typically will have a handful of standard examples like this, and then I'll have a catch-all of, like, if for some reason they just don't want to test because, I don't know, that's their prerogative. Technically they can, but you might want to, get blessings from SVP, EVP, CEO at that point. That may be a little egregious, but you get my point. So spend some time thinking on that exceptions process. All right, let's talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities and breaking down those silos. So I mentioned before, building out your testing program standard is going to be very helpful for you. You are going to need to define, this needs to be tested in this time frame. But for this approach to a work, you also need to make sure that it's very clear who owns and is responsible for that test, so that if it doesn't have a chance to get performed, who carries the risk and who has the responsibility of remedying it. And so those are very important things to discuss, and it will vary quite a bit at your company depending on sort of the appetite and how you look at like IT versus business responsibility. So a lot of the times I'll have questions that will come up about, if the application needs to test, but IT tells me it can't test, what do I do? And who has that accountability? And so you'll want to make sure that you spend some time really defining what that looks like on the front end, because likely IT is the one who's going to have the time to execute the test. But until then, the business carries the risk. And so make sure that you're clear on how you represent that red or yellow, however you want to flag that, on whose dashboard, so to speak. That will be very helpful for you to be very clear in who's being held to these specific standards that you're putting out. And this may take some time and some conversation on the front end as you're working to build that program. Okay, so let's talk about a few specific roles and responsibilities that you should consider putting into your program. I'm going to call out a few roles here, some of which might make sense for your organizations, others may not. And there may be more that I'm not even articulating here. But I do want to highlight, it's very important to make sure that you have a testing program sponsor. Now, we talked a lot about, right, we've usually got BC teams and DR teams and cyber teams, and they might exist in different organizations. My challenge to you is to find not the leader of BC or not the leader of DR for a program sponsor, but find a role in your company that has the appropriate authority and reach over the entirety of the company, all of the parts and pieces that you're going to test. So this might be like a chief risk officer or a chief operations officer. It's going to look different in every different company, but they need to be able to have the authority to reprioritize, to, you know, give your performers feedback of, hey, this is a clear priority. This is something you need to focus your time on. If you're only defining that within your smaller organization, right, your testing program sponsor might not have reach to mandate that, you know, an operations employee do X, Y, Z. So make sure you're making that testing program at a high enough level to give it the teeth that it needs to be effective. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure that you have a testing program manager, and that's probably going to be the you or me, the person responsible on a day-to-day basis for defining the program, making sure that people are performing the exercises, making sure that they're giving you the results in the format that you need them. And you may have more than one. You might, you know, assign a testing manager team so you can focus on different, you know, resource types or whatever the case may be. But you definitely want to have someone responsible from a day-to-day basis to manage this. Now, here's another interesting concept. I talked about having a testing program sponsor. That's making sure that you've got the program support and leadership that you need. I would also say if you're doing those big exercises like a data center outage scenario where you're, you know, maybe recovering a number of applications and bringing the business in, you might consider having exercise specific accountable executives in addition to the program sponsor to give you that authority and, again, teeth at the exercise level. If you run into any concerns, you need to escalate, you need to determine, you know, how to deal with something that's popped up. So typically for like an ITDR exercise, I will usually tap like a CTO or like a VP in IT, as well as someone in operations, because then you've got business and IT representation. Because remember, a lot of this is going to go back from the people who are testing the resources might not be the people who are impacted by the results of the tests. So make sure that you've got the right people assigned to support at the programmatic and per exercise level. And then, of course, you're going to want to have support subject matter experts, right? You're going to say all applications need to test, all facilities need to test. Well, in order to do that, you're probably going to have to work with the facilities team and the IT team. And so we've got a future slide that talks a little bit about establishing that partnership and including them in the program to define some of the requirements. But it's important that you call those out and make sure that you've got the right resources to help in that space as well. And then plan owners. It's very important that you articulate the role that plan owners have in this process, which is making sure that their BIAs are up to date, right, with good information, because that's what's scoping your exercise, and then making sure that they understand the exercises, the outputs of the exercises, and what it means for them. And I've got a few specific examples in some future slides that will articulate this a bit more. But when you define those roles and responsibilities, do not forget about this piece. Not only do they have to manage their BIAs and plans on an annual basis, but under this model, they would have the accountability to also help you with those conversations on business impact assessment based upon the results. So defining that early on is going to behoove you and make your process quite a bit more effective. Okay, so spend some time on roles and responsibilities. Just because you can't do it all yourself doesn't mean that you can't form the relationships and partnerships and get all these folks aligned to the testing program so that you have the right support and performers throughout the duration of all the different test types that are going to occur. Now, another thing that you're going to want to do is spend some time defining what I call success criteria. This gets sticky, and this is something we forget to talk about until we get stuck in the conversations. A lot of the times it's after the fact and we go, gosh, wouldn't it have been nice if we spent some time thinking about this ahead of time? This is another key area where you can work with your partners and break down those silos to define what success of each of these exercise types look like. Okay, so defining success and metrics is going to be key, right? If I say all applications have to test on an annual basis, well, what does that mean? How much do they have to test? Do they have to run for certain periods of time? Do they have to have business validations, right? What all does that entail? So I'm going to give you a few examples that have come up that have been really, really good conversational topics through the scope of these exercises. And these are just a few examples of things that you would want to factor in as well. So here's one that I dealt quite a bit with. If an application recovers, but just slightly over RTO or RPO, does it pass? Also, what happens if the application gets recovered in its recovery time objective, but the data is not what you expect, right? It missed its RPO. Or what if it met RPO and missed RTO, right? There's a lot of different variations and flavors there. What about business functionality, right? Can IT just fail over an application and say it was there running? Or does the business or do customers have to actually log into the application to, to validate that it actually works when they, are running it? What about real life events, right? If we've required that an application do a test on an annual basis and they just had a major outage last week, can they get credit for that in this exercise, or do they have to do an exercise on top of that? Active applications, those are always fun. I've had some companies say that if they're active and they're running in multiple environments, that they maybe don't need to test. I think in the financial institutions industry, what I see more often than not is that's, they can't get away with that. And so active applications actually have to take one instance out and run all traffic in the other location for a period of time to get credit. And so, maybe that's how you require testing there. But even then, how do you measure RTO? So there's a lot of nuance when it comes to defining what is a successful test that needs to be considered. Another fun one that I'm sure any of my IT guys on here are kind of giggling about, because I'm sure these are pain points you've been dealing with. What about when you have hybrid applications? Sit in front of a vendor application, and they both have to work. Like if I have to do a DR test for one and the other one is not in scope, it's not going to work unless they talk to each other. How do I test that? What does success look like in a pattern like that? If I require vendors do tests, I might require that I can participate with them or that they produce test results. What if they don't produce test results, or what if they won't let us participate, right? So there is a lot of nuance that it would behoove you to spend time on the front end to define what success actually looks like. And again, I cannot stress enough, this is one of the best ways I have ever found to bridge the gap between business and IT, because when you sit down and design this together, you just get a lot more sort of support and buy-in. You're going to work through a lot of the nuances, frankly, that some of us bang our heads against the wall on when we're trying to work with IT and understand what they mean. So bringing these folks to the table and having them participate in the development of your exercise program is very key and very, very helpful. So make sure you spend time on this as well as you're building this testing program out. All right, let's talk about end-to-end testing in a hybrid environment, and also how you can translate your testing results into resilience posture metrics. End-to-end testing in a hybrid environment. I am sure that many of you have run into this struggle over the years. I think this is a pain point that we've all kind of felt, right? As I mentioned before, we all don't sit in one office building where all of our IT is, and it's just not a pattern that we really have anymore. So what I have on my screen is a gross simplification, right, of what it might look like. And it's really just intended to say you're probably going to do a number of different types of tests, or have real life events, or a system outage and you do manual workarounds for a day while the system's out in real life. Like all of those things are going to occur. The intent is, you keep doing those exercises and they occur throughout the year, and you standardize the results, right? As people are experiencing all these, you must produce results like this. So then at the end of the year, you can take all of that, put it in this nice little funnel, and generate your exercise report. That's how you accomplish the end-to-end testing in a hybrid environment. Now, a lot of you might be getting more comfortable with this because this is something that we've been dealing with for a number of years, and we might really know that this is how we need to do that end-to-end testing. But I would say that I think a lot of companies will have the miss on the piece that we talked about with the impact analysis. Just saying, 90 out of 100 of my applications met their RTO throughout the year, and 50% of my suppliers passed, or whatever metric it is that's out there. It's good information to have, but it does not tell your whole story, nor does it help tell your end-to-end testing if you really want to look at it that way, right? Having the data, that's end-to-end, but or it's end-to-end from the process, but it does not actually layer the business pieces on top of it. And so what I would recommend is that for your annual testing report, you actually add a layer in from what I've recommended even so far. And first would be, throughout the year, you're getting all of those results. And this is where spending time on developing the templates, the values that are selected, the way in which, the different test types produce the results is going to behoove you quite a bit. Having that standardization so that as these test results come in month after month, day after day for all the applications and everything that's being tested, then you take all of those results at a point in time, whether it's a year end or if you do that in quarter one after a year, whatever the case may look like, go ahead and consolidate those all. So you have one big report with all the results. Now you need to pull the BIA information, right? All the application suppliers, facilities in each BIA, and you translate those results to BIAs. So Mr. Department Lead, you use these 10 applications. Here's the results for all 10. By the way, one wasn't able to test because it doesn't have disaster recovery. We also partnered with supplier management, and these, third-party risk management exercises occurred, and this notification exercise occurred. You're customizing those results and giving the business the specific results that they're concerned about specific to their process. And I'll show you an example here in just a moment. That's just step one. That's great. That's super helpful, right? You've got the results standalone, then you've got them related to a business process. The next step is to have the business actually look at the results through their business lens and look at each individual result and be able to tell their impacts. If this all were my environment, right? How would my process have impacted if I had an application that took 4 hours longer than we anticipated for it to recover? How would my process have fared? Right? And it could be to your benefit, right? We find a lot of times where, an application may have missed its RTO, but the business had manual workarounds that would have sustained their process for a period of time. It's helpful to tell that story. And that's, again, going back, storytelling is going to be your biggest key piece. That can be your so what to your auditors and your regulators, if that case occurs. But it is important to make sure that the business is weighing in, and we do forget that quite a bit. After the business has had a chance to weigh in, that's when you create your final report, right? Which is a summary and a consolidation of all of the technical results, all the facility results, all of the notification results, whatever the case may be, with the business narrative, so that you can tell the story of, yeah, we would have been fine as a company. Yeah, we could have continued to deliver our critical processes. And here's how we know. Okay. So this is the key point. Make sure that you're factoring in those impacts when you're telling that story. And here's an example, and I apologize. This slide is also very busy. This is also one that I think is probably best used as a tool behind the scenes. But generally speaking, right, here's a sort of a visual, a very simplified visual as to how you could put this back in front of the business, where you're saying, see if my mouse is over here. Well, I can't get my mouse on the screen, but in the top left-hand corner, you've got, a summary of, we did a notification exercise. Over time, you got a little bit better, right? You didn't do great the first time, but you got better. Then we tested the individual facilities you sit at. One of them got tested. It was great. We didn't test one of them for, I don't know, whatever reason. And so, that looks like a glaring red because we should have tested it, but we didn't. But in this case, the business has said, we can work from home. So that it might look bad, but that's not a big impact to our process. And so we've got the same thing with example applications, right? You can say your requested RTO was this. This is how it actually accomplished that RTO in the exercise. I do think it is important to present the results back to the business from the technical perspective, but then that business impact assessment narrative gives you that additional flavor. So again, this could look a variety of different ways, and it's, you might need multitudes of slides to kind of cover all of the different dependencies, but this gives the business the singular view as to how their processes would have performed based on all of their resources that they would have tested. And it does include sort of the top, I apologize, I can't get my mouse to go on the screen, but, I can also account for the tests that they did of their plans, of their strategies, the use of manual workarounds in case the application is not up and running. So this is the type of story that we need to be telling specific to testing, not just RTO met or, vendor test results received. It's really, truly understanding the implications to your business specifically. So definitely, I would say if you have the ability to download this deck, this may be a helpful slide to get you kind of started or to use as a reference point. I would imagine what you're going to build is probably going to look a little different, but it really does then give you the ability to assess the process level. And then in the top right-hand corner, you can see where I've thrown in, a generic metric here. You might actually put some logarithms behind this, but we essentially are assigning this specific process an index. All right, guys, so that's a visual of how it all sort of ties together. And then, of course, you take the narrative, right? These might be, if you had these slides per process, I would consider, right, these are just appendix. You still need to do the narrative and tell the story about how all of this glued together, how all business processes glued together, and your resilience posture as a whole. All right, to go ahead and get us wrapped up, I'm going to go ahead and just hit on some of the highlights that I really want to make sure that are takeaways from this discussion. So first and foremost, again, all dependencies and strategies should be in scope for your testing program. Challenge yourself to not think about whether or not things can be tested from the get-go. That's later on in the process. Your scope should be cohesive and it should account for everything that you need and that you care about in a business process. Additionally, your testing program should account for the tests that the business continuity teams would do, the strategies they would have in place in the event the resources are not available. So manual workarounds, work from home, things of that nature. Make sure that those are included. Also consider scoping your high-risk scenarios, right? A lot of us, we've gotten used to all hazards planning where we're doing scenario agnostic planning. That's great. That makes a lot of sense. But the fact of the matter is there are just some high-risk scenarios like pandemics and cyber events, and the list may be increasing every day here. I know we've got a few things going on in the world, but making sure that you're assessing those types of scenarios and their impacts on your company and then testing appropriately, like your crisis management team activations and things of those nature are also going to be helpful. And then make sure that when it comes to accomplishing end-to-end testing, that you're not only consolidating results, but that you're getting those impact statements from the business so you get the true whole end-to-end story so that you can tell that bigger resiliency posture story for your program holistically. All right. It's amazing to think that I got through all of that in a short period of time. As I mentioned before, I am available if there's additional conversations that folks do want to have with me. But in the meantime, I think we have some time for some questions. So Jeff, if we've got those, I'll be happy to take some of those.
Yeah, I'm back. And as a matter of fact, we do have a few questions. First, I would like to just tell everybody, because I'm sure it comes up in the chat, we will be putting this on our website tomorrow, hopefully, drii.org/webinars. That will include the slide decks for anybody who's interested in them. So yes, let's get to a few questions. The first we've got is, how long does it usually take to roll out a program of this size?
Oh, that's a great question. We've talked a lot about, like, there's some nuances that do need to be worked out. So it's certainly not something I think you can do the I dream of Jeannie, right? You can't whip your head out and just like nod your head forward and implement this right away. So I would say between 6 months to a year. And generally, I would recommend that you consider, right, spending some time on the front end to really do that development of the exceptions process, clearly defining success criteria, working with your partners and designing that together to work out some of the kinks and nuances. And then the other two things that I recommend is doing some sort of a roadshow where you have the opportunity to socialize this to your organization as a whole, because it's going to have far-reaching implications, right? You're pulling in resources from a lot of different areas. And then another thing that I have done is in a case like this, if it's a significant change from the current testing program, you might also consider doing a soft rollout where you're not holding people, accountable to the reds or the misses, right? For the first year, maybe you just show them what it would look like so they have the opportunity to get things cleaned up and then, make it go live the following year. But I would say plan on a 6 to 12 month build and then go from there. Good question.
Okay. All right. Let's see what else. How do real life events or outages feed into this process?
That's a good question. I do think that this can vary depending on your organization and the types of situations that can occur, but I am a huge, huge fan of utilizing live events in place of exercises wherever possible, because they frankly are a little bit more real. Now, here's the difference that people are usually not used to. In real life events, they're probably using their incident management tools and tracking things, via the normal methodology. I always say in order to have a real life event get credit, right, you have to predefine that success criteria ahead of time. And right, you might be able to get credit for a real life event, but there are certain things that you're going to need to do. You're probably going to have to write up a summary of what happened, do some of those lessons learned. And, did you capture your RTO if it's an application? So generally speaking, yes, I would give credit for those live events, but make sure that you have factored in some of the nuances so that folks know what's coming to them and they can't just say, here's a ticket number, we passed, move on.
Okay. And let's see what else. Okay. What are some lessons learned from rolling out a process like this?
Oh gosh, how much more time do we have? No, there's certainly a lot, but I think probably I would say one of the most helpful things is if we are going to define the testing scope based on BIA requirements, it would really behoove you to make sure that your BIAs are refreshed beforehand, because as soon as you start putting these components out, that's when people are going to say, oh, wait, it doesn't need to be in scope. I didn't mean for that to be there. Let me go clean up my BIA. So typically I'll go through a process of, hey, we're getting ready to pull scope. Everybody go out, do your validations, make sure everything's good first, because it does take some time to pull all that together. So that you don't have to redo it after everybody makes their updates. I would recommend just doing that on the front end, because it's going to be a thing.
Okay. So we are coming up on our time. So I believe we could wrap this up. If we did not get to questions, and I mean, we didn't get to all the questions, Jamie, you'll have time to answer them via email at some point in the next week or so?
Absolutely, guys. And for those of you who know me, I'm very passionate about this. So if this is something you want to talk more about, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, great. Jamie, thank you once again for your time today. And audience, thank you for showing up. Appreciate it. Reminder one more time, the presentation and the slides will be available on the DRI website. That's drii.org/webinars. And with that, I hope you all have a good day.